live stream web series produced on the occasion of Futurespective, an exhibition with events and happenings that demonstrate how design inquiry engages in open-ended and extra-disciplinary exchange. Design Inquiry Futurespective runs through December 14th at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the Maine College of Art in Portland, Maine. I'm Gabrielle Esperdy in New York City.
And I'm Jimmy Liu in Austin, Texas. Futurespective asks a simple question. What does it mean to rethink the past in the present to point to the future? And each Thursday, for the duration of the exhibition, we will gather a diverse group of thinkers and makers to kick around answers to this question relative to design, culture, or anything else our guests want to discuss.
And today on our first episode, we're going to be joined for our main interview by Wright and Kate Jarboe, who are part of the Montreal-based art and design collective, AKOK. They are currently in residence this week at the Maine College of Art as part of the Futurespective. And later on, we'll also visit with Judith Vanden and Gunther Wehmeyer, who have arrived at the ICA from the Netherlands to participate in DesignInquiry's pop-up inquiry on the topic of currency. Well, Jimmy, hello there.
Gabrielle, hello. Now we're actually both remote.
Yes, it's kind of exciting. I feel like we should also say hello, universe, because now we really are using the cloud to have this conversation between us and folks who are currently in Portland, Maine.
Yes. So I was just watching our practice episode last week, and I was just noting how delightful of a conversationalist you are. And I was like, this is going to be super fun to be in conversation with someone who has the gift of gab.
Yes, the gift of gab, something that I was persecuted by when I was a young Catholic schoolgirl.
No way, me too. You know, like in elementary school, we would get these, take-home reports.
Yes.
And the only phrase in English that my non-English speaking mother would know is they would write on my report, "talks too much." And that was the only phrase that my mother would refer to me as.
Yeah, talks too much. No, I also, we used to get a conduct grade. And I always would have very good grades, except for conduct. And I think that mainly had to do with being a young person of the female persuasion who spoke too much, or who let her opinion be known. One of the biggest catastrophes of grade school was getting into an argument about whether or not little girls could climb trees in skirts. I still don't quite understand why that was such a problem. But I refused to back down and to say that little girls could not climb trees in skirts, because if you saw up someone's dress, it was on you whether or not you were titillated by that all-cotton Carter's smarty pant.
Oh, so great.
And what design issues have you been dealing with this week back in Texas?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so like we are right now at midterm almost, and the students are I think at the midterm meltdown point. So this morning I just came from my a sophomore level studio, and it was a rough morning. It was a rough morning for everyone. We had to literally take a minute to recalibrate. I was like, stop, everyone stop. We cannot move on until we address like everyone's like mood and meltdown moments. Yeah. How about you?
We are not quite at midterm yet, but there's definitely, shall we say, tension in the air. But there's also that kind of leading up to midterm seriousness where everyone is realizing that, oh, wow, okay, we're not just kicking around the first couple of weeks of school. We actually need to get serious about whatever our intellectual or design agenda is. And I have to say, having come back from a week-long full immersion design inquiry 24/7 install, it was actually, aside from being nice to get to bed early, it was really nice to have the opportunity to take some design inquiry thinking and push it in some of my classes, particularly while I was helping students try to figure out research projects for the semester. So it felt good to be engaged in a continuation of the stimulating conversations that started in Portland last week.
Yeah, I was definitely re-energized by being there, even for just kind of the weekend, really. And I was being a masochist a little bit and rewatching our episode 0, and I really enjoyed having that conversation with you guys last week, with you and Margot and Denise and Emily, the curators of the exhibition. And I want to mention that the article that I was quoting from last week that was on Design Observer, I'm not sure I gave a shout out to the authors. So I want to take a minute this week to give a shout out to Lucy Hitchcock and Holly Willis, who were the authors of that wonderful article that really kind of got to, maybe we'll call it the gestalt of design inquiry. So shout out.
Yes, thank you. It was a very useful article, and it's also really nice to have those kinds of observations from folks who, I guess we could say, are straddling the kind of inside the design inquiry universe and outside the design inquiry universe. So we were very thankful for that, and of course the timing couldn't be better because one wants to spread the word about not only the exhibition but the kind of continued work of design inquiry.
Yes, and I was going down an internet hole kind of post being in Portland last week, and I was just remarking to myself as to how large the design inquiry universe actually is. And also how diverse. And so I'm really, really looking forward to being in conversation with the universe over the next 8 weeks. 8 weeks. We'll be doing this for 8 weeks.
I know. It's one of our colleagues, Gail Swanland, said it's like teaching another course, which is perhaps the pejorative way of putting it. I'd rather think about it as that. Let's think of it as those faculty meetings that you always wished you had, but you never really do, where you think you're going to discuss these kind of deep philosophical questions about discourse and pedagogy and such. We all know that never happens when you're dealing with, did we approve the minutes from last time? But this will be our opportunity to really not only just deal with folks in the immediate universe, but also to branch out and to connect with other people in diverse corners of the design world. So I think that's very exciting. It also gives us a nice focus to the week, something to look forward to on Thursdays from 11:30 to 1:20.
Yes, audience out in internet land, remember Thursdays 11:30 to 1:20 Eastern time. You can visit with us. I should say that if people are watching, and you're on our YouTube live stream, you can write comments, ask questions, and we will be able to see them and respond to them. So as our guests each week are on and in conversation with us, so too can you, internet people.
Yeah, and I'll also point out that if you're not available at 11:30 Eastern for the live stream, you can also watch these episodes at your convenience. The most recent episode will be the featured video when you go to Design Inquiry's YouTube page, but you can also find them by clicking on the Universal Lunch playlist, which will be updated each week right after our episode.
Yeah, I get kind of mortified thinking that we'll be permanently-ish on the internet.
Well, permanent. I don't know. We don't need to worry about the permanence because, as we know, we're still in the digital dark ages. The servers are all going to die. Somehow, these will completely disappear. And when people are writing the subsequent history of design discourse, they'll say there was this thing called Design Inquiry, and we have traces of their publications, but everything else seems to have evaporated in that period in the first couple of decades of the 21st century when they had no idea how to save anything.
Truly, we're just going to get in the digital dustbin.
I will apologize for that phone ringing in the background. I still have a landline. It is undoubtedly a mortgage company in China telling me that it's my last opportunity to refinance. But it'll turn off in a moment.
Oh my God, is that an answering machine? Do you have an answering machine too?
Yeah, we have an answering machine. We still believe very strongly in both analog and digital technology, or rather what I should call the appearance of analog technology, since, of course, that phone line is only masquerading as a landline. It's actually voice over internet protocol that is just pretending like it's a landline. But that only happened a year ago. In New York City, there are still copper wires everywhere. And it was only when the local phone company said they were no longer going to maintain the copper wires that many of us were forced to finally do the switch. But let us not forget that during major catastrophes, the landlines used to work, and that's not going to be the case anymore.
No, I think about that all the time. Like, what are we going to do in a disaster? We're going to have to, I don't know what. Dark. Okay. Well, I'm going to shift away from our dark apocalyptical thoughts. We have some awesome guests today I can't wait to get to know. Shall we begin?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, our first guests today are art and design collective called AK/OK, comprised of Wright and Kate Jarboe. They are based in Montreal, and their practice is driven by an interest in marginalized histories and spaces, and rooted in the research of queer and feminist archives, overlooked historical sites, and contemporary culture. Em and Kate, welcome to Universal Lunch.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I love that you're connected by your headphones.
Right. We don't have a splitter, but we're making it work.
Yeah, this further reinforces your collaborative nature, I think. Now we're visually seeing it.
We'll split it in half, and whoever gets the larger piece gets to make a wish. Yeah, exactly.
I love it. So since this is called Universal Lunch, I am interested in what did you have for lunch today, or have you had lunch yet?
That's a very future-oriented question, since we have not yet had lunch.
Right. I had an air sandwich. No.
Oh, delicious.
So good.
We have a nice picnic with us here. We did a workshop with the design students, and they made drawings for us of some of the items that lived at a peace encampment in the early 1980s, which is the center of our research now, which we'll tell you more about. But there was food on the table. this morning. So this is the lunch we're looking at right now.
Right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Charles is baking bread.
So jealous.
If only we had the aroma floating through us right now.
So jealous of you who get to be in that space. I miss it already.
And that's a reference to Charles Melcher, who is on the faculty of the Maine College of Art, is an expert bread baker, and in his capacity as the design inquirer, has installed a bread cart / mobile kitchen in the rear gallery at the Institute for Contemporary Art.
How long till that bread's done?
Charles, we have a question from Universal Lunch. How long until the bread is done?
How long what?
Until the bread is done.
This is sourdough right now. It'll be done tomorrow, but we'll bake some oatmeal. It'll be done tonight for dinner.
So that will be universal dinner rather than universal lunch, but that's okay. So one of the things that we are particularly interested in at Universal Lunch as our web series is not just the work that you're producing right now, and we're going to get to that, but we're also really interested in the ideas that feed your work. And we were wondering if, by way of getting us started, if we could ask you to trace a line backwards through your practice, through your education, maybe through your upbringing, if that's relevant, to try and unpack formative experiences, institutions, or people who have shaped what you might call your particular school of thought. Any perspectives that you want to offer that will help us understand, and our audience, of course, who you are as artists and designers?
Well, Kate and I were talking about this last night and this morning. We've actually been having some really interesting conversations with people here, with some of the other guest designers, with the designers who are students here at Mecca, about what is it that drives us to make work that is political, that is interested in our current political and social situation and ways to shift it, and for us, one of the important things as us as a collective is that we are partners in life as well as partners in work, and so identifying as women, as lesbians, in what is still a very patriarchal and capitalist culture coming from, it's all of a piece. And so the conversations that we have about our feelings about current events, or the things that people are going through now, kind of naturally come out in the work. But we were trying to get more retrospective about it, and realizing that both of us had really formative experiences as young people in school with specific teachers. And this is looking back now for me, to fifth grade specifically. And I was thinking, I hadn't thought about her in a long time, but I do think about her from time to time. And my fifth grade teacher, Ms. Rosemary Griffith, was the first woman I ever knew who was Ms. I had to get to the fifth grade to encounter a woman who used the title Ms. And
may I ask where that was?
Yeah. This was at University Park Elementary School, part of the public school system in Fairbanks, Alaska. A very well-funded public school system there that works better than others that I have worked in subsequently in other places around the U.S. Very lucky in that way. But I should say, so the school was overcrowded. There was no room for our 5th grade class in the school building that year. So there was a temporary trailer that was set up in a parking lot in the back of the school. And this afforded us a certain amount of lack of supervision or feeling of supervision from the authorities in the school. And looking back on it, I realized that Ms. Griffith was very much a radical educator, interested in alternative forms of pedagogy. And as a 5th grader, I just really appreciated that she saw us all as individuals. And we were in that little trailer out in the parking lot. We would often go out into the parking lot or the playground during lessons to do things, to illustrate concepts in a more physical space. Very embodied sort of way of learning. And we started every morning with a morning warm-up, and she would put on music. We could all request music, and we would get up from behind our desks and we would dance. That was the very beginning of each day. Things that if we were in the main school building, somebody might have been walking down the corridor and kind of wondered what was going on, but we had our own little satellite to have this alternative educational experience. And there was a lot of room for creative activity and to take lessons into, like, make a skit out of something we'd learned, or to make drawings and make little zines. And so that's as a lifelong student and as a teacher, these are like things that I thank Ms. Griffith for, to kind of open up an idea of what school could be.
Yeah, sort of the opportunity for play within structure.
Yes. Okay. So one specific day that I remember very vividly, it was in the middle of winter, and the parking lot had been plowed, over the course of months, and this big mountain of dirty snow had built up at the edge of the parking lot, and it's kind of tiered in steps, kind of ziggurat-like, and all of us in our winter togs getting up on different levels of the snow berm, and Ms. Griffiths brought out the boom box, and one of our classmates taught us all how to do the butt, which was a dance craze.
The butt, B-U-T-T?
B-U-T-T, which involves a lot of boogieing.
Okay, if we have time later, I'm going to ask both of you to demonstrate the butt move.
Yes. I'm sure it's got to have a comeback. It's due.
And what about you, Kate? Do you have a comparable, either early educator or some parallel kind of formative experience?
I do think I do. From an early educator, another sort of radical woman educator from grade school as well. It was my art teacher I had for 6 years in a Catholic school, actually. She was a radical sort of Corita Kent style nun. And she was amazing, and she was really had this. She was a carpenter, she was a maker, she was an artist. She did all of these things, and she was also a person who repurposed everything. So we would save all of our milk cartons, we would save juice things, whatever, everything, and then she would make things out of these or bring them into the classroom, and we would make things out of them as well. She was very influential. She also. The school I went to, it was very concerned with social justice issues, and so even as children, that, it was always about our education was really one of the themes that ran through everything, including our art classes, were just basically focusing outward on other people, and having an interest in the world beyond not just our town or our classroom or our family, but so. So I do think that she was a very, because the school, I think, was primarily run by women and, a religious order of nuns. It was also kind of this, in a way, like a radical women's community. It was a different way of, sort of living that, when I think back on it now, it was, it was pretty progressive, even though we don't normally...
What order of nuns was that?
These were Benedictine.
Ah, right. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that means. Does that signify something?
Well, the Benedictines have they're not necessarily a teaching order in the same way that, say, Sisters of St. Joseph are.
Or Jesuit,
yeah.
or something.
Oh, yeah, I
like
do
that.
know about the Jesuits.
And where was this, Kate?
This was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, actually. And even to be a Catholic there, you're in quite a minority. So so it was interesting. It was an interesting place to be, and an interesting sort of. My mom was also a teacher at this school, and so we knew these nuns as people, also in addition to just as educators. And they had this funny tradition where they would come to our house for Halloween. I'm not. It's like really weird, but they would come over and hang out with us. And so we would play like video games and ping pong with these nuns that would come. They didn't come. They would come like once a year, and it would be on Halloween. I'm not sure like exactly like how that tradition started, but so they had this really old like International Harvester Scout. It was huge, and they would fit like 6 to 8. I think probably maybe not more than 6 people in it. But anyway, as many as they could, and they would come make their annual visit and hang out with us.
That sounds like something in a Fellini film. This
exactly.
A truck full of nuns coming from the plains to visit you on Halloween.
Yeah.
It is, you bring up a really interesting issue, though, about Catholic schools in general and the intersection of Catholic education and progressive values. And you were really starting to say something that I think is worth pointing out, particularly in the aftermath of, say, Vatican II, and the way that a younger generation of nuns might have, by the 70s and then into the 80s, really embraced progressive values. Because I know going to Catholic school, particularly elementary school in the 70s, there was a younger generation of what we used to jokingly call the peace love nuns. And it's interesting to think about that kind of continuing on, because I assume the nuns who taught you did not have nun names. They probably went by their given names.
No, actually they did have them, but then later on, junior high school, then they started using more, they didn't wear the habit anymore necessarily. They weren't like, some of them had their own names. But they did have names that were not their own, that were, that they had chosen. So, and the amazing art teacher that was so inspirational to me, her name, a lot of them have Mary or some variation of Mary or Marie or something as part of it. It's like a hyphenated, and hers was not. Her name was Scholastica. Wow. So she had this super amazing name too that was completely outside of anything I'd ever heard of. And so she was, it was amazing.
She's like a superhero.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, she was very much like, I think, Karita Kent in a lot of ways, and really interesting. Yeah.
So can I ask you, so you both had these kind of really early formative experiences with, I might call them an alternative educational approach or a more progressive one. When did that moment or those experiences begin to find their way into your own practice in terms of a sense of agency to yourself begin to create similar spaces through your work as artists or designers? Like, when did that happen for you? Because like we have these experiences and they shape us, but we're kind of unaware of it at the time. But then when do you think that shift happened between like having that experience, being into it, and then beginning to recreate that experience for others?
Well, it's probably moments that are sort of like punctuated over the course of time. Like I did work in Chicago with young students whose art programs have been cut in public schools, and helping with a group of really committed people to create summer fine arts camps and things like that offered definitely really engaged, alternative educational experiences. And but in terms of finding a way for that to come home into our creative practice, I think that there were different ways we found of doing it in our lives, but to really bring it in and as artist and designer, it was, maybe 5 years ago when we started working together.
Well, I was also thinking that when we first met each other at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, we were both engaged in a lot of activism and political protest. And so, we kind of, like, when we first started hanging out, that was one of the things that we were doing together. And then we also were both working in an art library. And I feel like they're like those sort of things, like initially that we were interested in or whatever, definitely we've kind of carried forward as part of our practice in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, and for me, there was a lot of internal questioning of, like, we're marching in the streets, we're doing direct action, we're working on political campaigns, just in our personal lives, sort of. And it was always an unresolved question for me of, why am I not doing more of this in my work? And once Kate and I started making projects together, I finally felt this come into focus, that these concerns that are so important to me as a person, now I can start to investigate, dig into, and express more fully as a designer.
Can I ask what you two were protesting at the time?
Yeah, we were in. We were both living in Chicago. It was not in our name. It was trying to refuse, the push to war in Iraq under second Bush.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember clearly one night we had just recently started hanging out, and we had been to a couple marches together. There was another march scheduled that night in downtown Chicago. I was not there, and I turned on the local news and saw that the march was huge. It had like gained steam from the earlier marches, and it was so big that the protesters had spilled out onto Lakeshore Drive, which was not part of the planned march route. The police were completely taken by surprise, and people on their evening commute were just stopped still on Lakeshore Drive. It was just miles of cars stacked up in every direction, and people just streaming
like around the cars. Yeah.
And I called Kate on her landline, and I said, "You have to see this. It's amazing. Like, the movement has really taken off. Look at what I'm watching the news right now, and there are people walking on Lakeshore Drive." And I realized, and here I am talking to your answering machine, and maybe you're out there on Lakeshore Drive right now. And she was. That's why she didn't answer the phone.
That's a little romantic, I think. Right.
Well, it was interesting too to be. In a protest that was so uncontrolled and sort of regulated and untamed, and to be walking among rush hour traffic on a main artery in a major city, and watching people like rolling their windows up quickly and trying to fearful. So it was a kind of an interesting experience, unlike the other all of the other sort of activists and protest things that.
After that, there were like phalanxes of police in riot gear, shoulder to shoulder along the route that had been pre-approved. And it was like, if you wanted to go to the bathroom or something, it was like, no, you are on this march route. There's no exit for you. You just got to stay in line.
It's also really interesting to see the body politic turn into its own organism in those kinds of protests when the sheer number of people occupying urban space mean that all of your quote unquote security measures get thrown out the door. And it's very different to watch that and then to kind of be experiencing it yourself. Becomes a kind of, particularly as designers, right? Because you stand there watching the flow of people, seeing them, hit a hard wall and wonder where they're going to go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We had a really interesting experience a week and a half ago. We were in Montreal for the climate strike. Greta Thunberg came up from New York City, and she led the march. And all we had, and I think all the information most anybody had, was, show up around 11:30. We're going to step off at noon from the monument in the park. And so we were there. In the end, they counted 500,000 people who came out for the march. It was hugely attended. The crowd was so large, we actually stood still for maybe 2 hours just waiting
for the front to
be able to move.
Right, and we weren't more than halfway, and from the beginning, and so it took a long time for everybody to physically move through the space. Yeah.
And was that in which park was that? Was it in Montreal or another park?
Yeah, it was.
Yes.
What was the crowd like? Was it a lot of young people, hopefully?
The young people are super mobilized there. They've actually been doing Fridays for Future since last spring. And so we live close enough that we can see them streaming, like walking down the street Fridays before noon. They're all on strike from school every Friday. The young, they're like high school and early college. And they've been doing it. And then the march a week and a half ago was all ages. It was all generations. It was
everybody together. It was really nice.
Babies and strollers.
Nice.
One thing that was. I was
sorry.
just going to say.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing that was really striking to us is that with 500,000 people all together, sort of like moving through the streets, they did not have a police presence.
This was what was so remarkable to us.
We were like, wow, in Canada it's so different. Like there wasn't any. There were a few police cars stationed periodically to make sure that the street was blocked in terms of nobody would be able to drive into the parade route. Into the march route. But beyond that, there was nothing. There were no one, and at the beginning, nobody at the end, nobody on the sides, nothing. It was just the people.
No riot gear. The police officers who were out were just wearing their regular uniforms and just kind of like leaning on the cruiser.
To make sure nobody came like driving into it. That was it.
But
those are true protest goals. I think a hope for America.
True, though it may also just be because it was a bunch of Canadians. Rod Sayers, the West Coast Canadian artist, told us last week, how do you get 24 Canadians out of a swimming pool? You say, hey, you Canadians, get out of the swimming pool. But that talking about protest and the kind of intersection of that and your practice might be an excellent segue to a question that Jimmy has for you.
Yes.
Okay.
So as I understand it, you are mobilizing some youth this week in Portland because you are currently in residence for Futurespective. Can you tell us a little bit about what you all have been up to and what remains to be done this week?
Sure, I can bring you up to date on it. One thing that we're doing every day is an action that we're proposing. It was not our idea. Originally, we're passing the word along from a group of women who wrote this letter over 35 years ago. So we like to imagine that they are still doing this, and now we're joining them. So, we can read the letter, which we've reproduced in different ways in the space here, and which we've activated with the students here. Dear Jimmy and Gabrielle, this is a chain letter, but not the usual kind. This is a chain letter to pass the word along.
A number of us in different parts of the country are taking part 3 times a day in a collective pause, a moment's time out from our daily routines. At each of these moments, we remind ourselves that other women are doing the same.
We stop and think about the new world we're trying to bring into being. A future of peace and justice, where no one and nothing in nature is treated as the other. A world in which we no longer live in fear for our lives and the life of the earth itself. We ask ourselves what changes are most needed to bring such a world into being, and ask ourselves what actions we can take to hasten these changes.
We take these brief times out upon waking at 11 a.m. and at sunset. We hope that many other women receiving this letter will want to join us.
We wake at different times, so our pauses upon waking will be varied. At 11 a.m., if we are at work, our stopping becomes a momentary strike. We can make our pauses as short as an instant, or make them as long and as noticeable as we want or dare. At sunset, we take our brief action again.
As the sun sets at different times around the globe and clocks say 11 at different times, we like to imagine successive waves of women pausing around the world.
If you want to be part of this action, share this letter with other women and allies. You may want to translate it or rewrite it in your own words, but please keep the times of day the same, upon waking, at 11 a.m., and at sunset.
Wow, that's amazing. It's kind of like it's like a feminist repositioning of, say, the Islamic call to prayer, where you take that time out of your regular whatever you're doing to connect with something larger than yourself as an individual. Can you tell us the provenance of this letter?
It was written by a group of 8 or 9 women who were all living together in a field that they had purchased, which was adjacent to an army base, where they had realized that nuclear missiles were being shipped from that army base, in upstate New York, across the Atlantic to American Air Force bases in the UK and Germany. This was in the early 1980s in the Cold War. And so these women were all living together in a self-organized collective society. It was women who came from all over the US and Canada and many other countries. There were women's peace camps already established in England, Italy, Netherlands, Germany. And so there was a worldwide, not worldwide, but there was a European and North American network of women's peace camps where women were going to live together and plan together creative forms of civil disobedience in protest to the nuclear arms race. And so this group of women had drafted many different versions of this letter, which we found in an archive we've been spending a lot of time with, which is now at the Schlesinger Library of American Women's History at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard. And so we came upon this letter in its many different forms and thought, yeah, they're inviting us to rewrite this letter and share it. So we better answer that call. It seemed pretty direct.
Yeah.
That's what we needed to do. Yeah. But we've been holding this strike and having different conversations. We've been making tea in the gallery at 11 a.m. Each morning and inviting people to take a pause, and even if it's a short one, that in doing that and reclaiming our time to think about the changes that need to happen to make the world a more just and peaceful one, that we're offering a resistance to all of these forces of capitalism and the orientation toward production, and that time must be productive, that you're on the clock. It just switches the mentality about that for a moment and says there's power in stopping. And we can all do it together, and the more people who do it, the more power there is in stopping.
So you brought up a word or a phrase that I'd like to unpack a little bit more. You said the phrase creative forms of civil disobedience. And I think that to me is such a powerful phrase to maybe describe the work that you're engaged in, and also the work that the ethos that you're bringing to your residency with these students. How have they been responding to that idea of creative civil disobedience?
Well, I think that it opens up new possibilities. We talked about with the students. We talked about these moments of mutation in the social fabric, which this peace encampment actually existed for 23 years. There were women living on this land. So this is a long blip in the social fabric, we should say. The duration of this is it's really remarkable. But whether it's a march, or an action that is of a shorter duration, even no matter how momentary, if it's a week on Vinyl Haven of living differently and thinking about design differently, that these smaller moments can act as a fulcrum for larger social transformations in our collective imagination. And so I think that there are students who've been joining us for tea who are very interested for the strike, in how their creative practice and their activist practice intermesh. And can an activist practice be a creative practice? And one of the reasons we find this research on the Women's Peace Encampment so rich with possibilities is both the creativity that they brought to their activist work. We can tell you a few examples just to spark imagination, but also the way that they were very mindfully forming a new way of living together, a new way of structuring a social group, a society, which was without hierarchy, which was based on a consensus model, which was mutually empowering and skill sharing. Which was in relation with the land and respect to the land and one another. Which, they were a really diverse group of women of different belief systems, different sexualities, different cultural upbringings, different races, different economic situations. And so their devotion to finding ways of coming together and making everyone heard is, we think, a model for where we need to go for the sustainment of human being together.
The planet.
So I think the students, it was really interesting to show the work that the women were doing, some of which looks a lot like art, some of which looks a lot like performance and street theater, and then also the ways that they were structuring their micro-society, both as creative practices, and doing that within the context of this exhibition where we have in large letters on the wall, everything is a practice, really seemed to be resonant. And so I'm going to say some of the actions that they took that were creative forms of civil disobedience.
Well, they did a lot of things that I think we would recognize today, sort of almost like bread and puppet, sort of theater, but they also did slow walking, which was a big part of their resistance. And in doing these sort of performative slow walks, one thing that we read about that we thought was really interesting is that when the police were approaching them and trying to, I don't know at that point if they were actually going to arrest them.
They did, yes.
Okay, so they were approaching them to arrest them. And the police started moving in a very slow way also as they were approaching them and, like coming toward them to arrest them. So they were sort of mirroring the movements of the women, so we thought that was really interesting and curious too, that it had this effect, even on the police, that was something. What else did they do? There were a lot of, they were really interested in different symbols. They were interested in, there was a lot of
the power of graphic design to support a activist political movement. Very evident. They had binders of clip art that they had made, specifically like feminist peace activist clip art,
like super grassroots looking,
really
and
delicious.
interesting, like handmade stuff that
they considered everybody an artist. I think that from our position, where I think a lot about everyone being a designer and how is everything a practice. They would come up with platforms for participatory forms of protest where they'd say, okay, here's a poster that we've left the center blank, but we put on it, life on a more peaceful planet, and now they've sent it out. Distributed it for people to draw what that means to them. And so there was one very important example with the flag.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of tension between the peace encampment and the rural community nearby, many of whom were employed at the army base. And they pictured themselves as sort of the typical bucolic small American town, all American town. And this positioned the women as necessarily un-American. So,
right.
And it was an international peace camp, so there were women who were not Americans.
Right. That's not what they meant.
Yeah. And so a self-appointed representative from the town went to the welcome area, the reception area at the peace encampment, and told the women that he wanted to donate a flag for them to fly at the encampment, and it was on behalf of the town. And if they accepted the flag, then he would run a big editorial in the local paper about how they were all patriots. And if they refused the flag, that he would run an editorial in the paper about how they were,
communists or something.
Communists,
yeah, basically.
So they were in a sort of a bind, and the group who met with him thought, well, let's accept it so that we aren't giving them any fodder to demonize us. But they put it to a decision-making process, and after many days of conversation and discussion and debate, they came to the realization that it wasn't a binary decision about whether to fly the American flag or not to fly the U.S. flag, but what they would do instead was say, there are some women here who feel like the U.S. flag is a symbol for what they stand for, and there are some women here who would feel more represented by other flags. So everyone, please make your own flag. And then they just flew all of these flags on the opening day of the peace encampment, which was July 4th.
Yeah,
appropriately.
Can I ask you real quick before we move on, what is left for this week for your residency? Can you quickly tell us about what is left, the work that is left to do?
Sure. Well, we'll continue to take our strike every day at 11 in the gallery and welcome people to join us. And we are today starting production on a small publication. So we're going to make an edition of between 40 and 50 books, much like the flag exercise that we just mentioned. There's a participatory element to it where we did a workshop with the students who all made drawings of different things that the women brought with them to the peace encampment, and which we didn't have any visual information about from our research in the archives. And so the students have manifested these visually for us to think about as things that maybe they're tools that now we can take into the future, because we're still working toward a future of peace and justice.
Right.
The encampment was called the Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice. So, it's part of a larger arc toward a future that we haven't arrived at yet.
Yeah.
So concentrating on making the book and continuing to have conversations around the 11 o'clock pause.
That's a wonderful, the way that you just framed that about looking at the encampment and pointing towards the future, because I wanted to ask you a question about the past and the present and the future, and you've actually set it up. You're taking this historical event that is represented in an archive, and you're using that as a way of activating, thinking through a new kind of, let's say, political and social space into the future. I have a question about that, and maybe you can just sort of address how you see the continuum of past, present, and future in this work. How is the encampment represented in the archive? What kinds of documents are in there that you have been able to, because those themselves are the past that you are engaging with in the present. So that's the first question I have for you. And then the second question, in terms of present and future, how do you see your own selves as designers, as queer folks, taking that work and then kind of reshaping it as you move it forward?
In terms of the materials in the archive, it's incredibly rich. The women were very mindful about building an archive for the future, and so at the time they were documenting everything. They formed a women's media collective that taped a lot of footage of all kinds of activities that happened in and around the encampment and during the protests that they staged.
I think also they weren't sure how much media coverage they would get through traditional channels. So right. I think, they formed the Women's Media Collective to make sure that it was documented and, that they had maybe some control over also how it was, the narrative. So there is quite a bit actually to draw from.
Yeah, they were extremely organized about it. They had videographers and photographers. Other materials in the archive represent the forms of communication for getting the word out about the encampment, because there were women who drove and walked, women who walked from North Carolina, so for over a week, who biked from Wisconsin, who drove from Alaska, a van of women from Minnesota. And so since this was very pre-digital, we have all of these newsletters and phone trees and personal letters that were being distributed to different peace networks and women's networks in order to get the word out. So that's fascinating to see all of those communications, which now I think about people organizing a grassroots movement. We'd have to be capturing Twitter feeds and printing them out, and it would be a mediated artifact of the communication. But we're seeing these newsletters that have been folded, that have been scribbled on, people writing people's phone numbers down.
Right. Even a doodle pad
documents
that would be near the telephone, where people would come and, they would each use the same phone to make a call. And so, people would just mindlessly be doodling things while they were sitting there on the phone or whatever. And it's this collective, piece of paper, a huge, pad or something where you can see everybody's mark making and everybody's notes. And so it's really interesting. There's a lot of things that seem really important, and a lot of things that seem really sort of insignificant also, but are also quite beautiful to look at. So
Yeah, there was a box of documents that were letters that had come into the encampment. So women who had been there and left and were writing letters back, or were writing to them in advance of coming, and were sending messages of support, or sending messages of solidarity from peace camps in Europe. And so it's like postcards that you can see the thumbtack holes in because they were tacked up in the office of the kind of like the HQ on the peace encampment land, the farmhouse that was there. And
so I think there's audio, video, printed matter and ephemera and
T-shirts.
Yeah, all sorts of different physical
signs.
Yeah. So for us, I mean, basically we took all of this as a departure point to use it as a template, right, for the future. As Em was saying, it was an encampment for the future of peace and justice, and because it hasn't happened yet for all people, and even the earth, we thought, this could be an interesting, just sort of model or a template, or to use these strategies to continue the work.
Right. A lot of the language that they were using about the existential threat, for them of nuclear war, for us, is such a strong echo of the current existential threat of climate crisis. And so we see this really strong through line.
Yeah.
And these messages that in order to continue to live together on the planet, and to work together against threats like this, that we have to work together in a way that is based in social justice principles, that in a collective way. And in terms of using these principles that they were operating with within the encampment, and using this as a fulcrum for future imaginaries and potential feminist futures. In terms of design practice, I was thinking about very urgent ways that design practice needs to pause and reorient, which is happening. It's happening, but I was thinking about some specific passages in the book Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar of a few years ago, which is obviously in conversation with Papanek's Design for the Real World. So now we have this idea of designs for the pluriverse, a pluriverse being a world in which many worlds fit, many worldviews fit. And the way that these women came together from different worldviews and found a way to work together, I find very instructive. And he talks about reorienting from the sort of focus that we've had of making things that perpetuate the systems of capitalism and patriarchy that we're kind of taking for granted as sort of the operating conditions for design, and instead finding new ways of working in relational modes of knowing and being and doing together. And so I see a lot of principles that are guiding me in a way as a designer and design educator, of reorienting design practice toward life-sustaining and social justice ways of being and designing. And something that's real tangible for me is the slowing down.
Yeah. And that something as simple as stopping can be a disruptive force, and that you can do that sort of furtively, right? And during the middle of your day, and no one even really knows, and you're doing that, and so I think that that's something that, a lot of people can participate in. And also just the idea too, that we're trying to I think have less of a separation, between art and design and life, that we're trying to sort of figure out if there's a possibility for it all just to kind of flow together.
I think there's a lot of exhaustion from trying to keep up with our current culture, our way of being, and compressing things into shorter and shorter time chunks.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's this research lab in the Netherlands called the Slow Design Lab, and now I'm really interested in what they're doing and how they've set out some guidelines for product designers, for how do you make products that encourage an interaction that takes time. And why is that a political project? It's a political project because you're disrupting, this march of time that we're all on the factory clock in ways, still.
Indeed, we are on this factory clock, and our time with you
Speaking of clocks,
quickly winding up. Wow, that really flew by. And I want to quickly close on, I'm wondering if you can give us a parting thought. We've talked a lot today about the artifacts of creative
Disobedience.
Yeah. And so your practice is very collaborative. Both you are partners, like you said, both in work and in life. Can you give us a parting thought about what that means for your practice and in relation to the topics that your practice engages?
Parting thoughts, yes.
What does that mean for you to be collaborators in work and life at a time when your work kind of encourages those slippages between different aspects of one's being?
Well, the personal is still political. And sort of like Design Inquiry says I don't know if I'm going to get the wording right, but that things don't end after, what is it? After dinner? Or
it doesn't end after dessert.
The conversation doesn't stop when dinner is served, or something to that effect.
Yes. Right. It was very true for the way that this kind of arrangement sets us up for
the sharing of
work
earbuds
and life. That there being a very fuzzy distinction between the two. But it doesn't have to only happen in a collaborative practice. That can be true for any practitioner. That if you're feeling a sense that there are things that you care about, or things that you notice are not right, that those things that you feel pulled toward in your daily life, in your being in the world, in your identity, in relation to the world, that those should be a part of your practice. Those can be a part of your practice. That the way we live out our days is a practice. So it's all connected.
If you are just joining us, we are wrapping up our conversation today with artists and designers Wright and Kate Jarboe of the collective AKOK. Kate and thank you so much for spending some time with us today on Universal Lunch. And I hope that you now have time to have some lunch. And we look forward to seeing the documents and outcomes of your week in Portland.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Great to talk with you both.
Yes, thank you. It was an exciting conversation.
Thanks.
And we're thrilled with that Kate and Em took some time to spend with us, and we're equally delighted to introduce our next guests, Judith Vanden and Gunther Wehmeyer, who are designers and researchers based in Europe, who have come to Portland to join DesignInquiry's pop-up gathering on the topic of currency. Judith and Gunther work together incidentally. They're both pursuing their own PhD projects, and we'll ask them to talk a little bit about their work. And the inquiry for them about currency was an opportunity to work together and to kind of think through what it meant to be collaborators on a particular project. So I think we are delighted to welcome the two of you.
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, Jimmy and Gabrielle. Good to be with you over distance.
Yes, absolutely. So, would you mind starting us off, telling us a little bit about the PhD research that you're both doing? Now, I think one of you maybe is finished, and the other is still working.
No, both going.
Okay.
Oh, well, congratulations on the continuing to go at it.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest. I think a PhD is the hardest one to capture in one sentence. But my PhD is on designing resonance. How can we design resonance in design process between people, between context, but also even an awareness to time, history, future. And I think there's lots of good things happening out there, more alternative processes, but often they're not really valid yet or seen as a process that is a realistic way to design new kind of scenarios or new ways of living or new ways of creating future together. So that's a nutshell version.
Yeah, my PhD, I'm not from product design, so I'm coming from urbanism, innovation, design thinking area, more conceptual thinking, foresight, idealizing better future through design. And my PhD is actually uniting my background in landscape and innovation, where I'm researching how we can self-lead ourselves with nature. So if you think about leadership and creative leadership in specialty, how we can lead companies or lead creative practices, ideally we should start with ourselves first. So how can we lead ourselves, and what does it mean? And to be in nature, become nature, and ultimately lead with nature. So there's lots of going on in these topics like biomimicry, Shinrin-yoku, and all these mindfulness, wellness things. And it's critically researching what does it mean and how can we use it also to drive innovation.
So that's definitely where we connect up together on this. It's this part of activism, of awareness, about responding to the context around us. And I think we're both really eager to make a change, enable change, partly start with ourselves, but also through teaching. I'm also head of department in the Netherlands of Artist Academy, where we had our shared practice for years, but also separated. So it's interesting how collaborating is also a kind of timeline of evolving, about connecting and working separate and a meeting again. So that's also how we came here together again for this 1 week in Portland.
I think it's also great to see these different layers of scale. So I'm used from education to work on really XXXL scales, using design thinking to solve your challenges or issues, and where Judith is working on material, product, and activism scale. So that kind of are opposites which are really complementary to each other.
Yeah, the human is always central in that. That's what we always realize. Like, doesn't matter what you do, but the core value is actually, so what does it mean to be human within that process?
It's interesting to think about the not just the continuum of scales that you both seem to be operating on, but also the way in which you're thinking about design and research absolutely connected to the notion of activism. Do you think that that is, and our last guests were also talking about the importance of an activist practice. Is that something that has always motivated your work, or is it something that has either come out more recently or specifically once you began your doctoral studies?
I think it started really already before we both went probably to art school. So this has always been our DNA of always feeling kind of not fitting in that system or flow, or feeling things could be differently, different perspective. When we met 15 years ago, it was the thing what connected us in work, but also privately, this really engagement for creating a vision that things can be done differently. And I think throughout the last 15 years, it's been constantly seeking different outlets. And we worked a lot abroad. The last 7 years, we've been based in the Netherlands now. And so it's also constantly engaging, revisiting, being really kind of receptive with your environment, but also with, there's so many wonderful people around the world. And I think often it's been seen as a form of, we're different. No, we're kind of together. We kind of share so much stuff that we are passionate about. And I think that's where the core part of activism is. It's about this relationship that you really feel connected on, and you can really create a positive front to move things forward differently.
Yeah, and adding to this, I think I understood myself in early times more as a misfit, someone who doesn't fit in with certain systems or design or in general. And it took quite a while to acknowledge that being misfits is actually good. Yeah. And there has been a book written by Alexa Clay a few years ago. It's called The Misfit Economy, and where she describes misfits or people who are living at the border of society, like pirates or mafia bosses, how they can use their being a misfit to really drive innovation, to be different, to be activists in a very different way. And what can we learn from those people? Yeah. So for us, being a misfit is actually quite good. It's what we're driving on.
I think you're going to find some good company at the Design Inquiry's pop-up gathering on the topic of currency. And I want to turn our conversation to that topic of currency. What is your interest in that topic, and how do you think you'll be examining it during this pop-up period while you're with potentially some other misfits?
I think what is interesting I think it's also when you think about currency, people think about finances or banking or extreme ways of moving economy forward. But I think what's interesting in the word currency, that there's the word current, kind of the ongoing stream, but also when you put the word in front of it, like recurrent, like what are we actually talking about? And I think for us it's really about turning it inside out and seeing currency actually as coming back to what is actually, or what are our values? What do we really want to create awareness about? And even in the beginning of the week, because we came here to work together also with Emily Luce, and it was really like, so what are we doing? We're unplanned, but on the other side, the designership in us is like rigid planned, and then it's about letting go. And it's this kind of clash you can have within you. And then we also said, so why are we actually together here? What is it? And then you realize we just want to spend time together. That's a currency. That's why we want to be here. We want to connect. And often that sounds like an invalid, leisurely kind of current, but it's probably the most lively, life-specific, most important thing of being human. We want to connect. And then that's beautiful to kind of experiment within art and design on that, to create an awareness around what does it mean to connect. And, but maybe he thinks something totally different.
No, I definitely connect on this, especially the way of seeing ourselves as currency. So how can we use ourselves to give and receive? Because like Judith said, mostly it is turned around the understanding of money as a form of currency to share and exchange goods and services. But that's very limited in the way of understanding currency. So I think also how can we use that term of currency with non-human entities? So, for instance, nature. So you heard that in New Zealand, 2 rivers recently received citizenship. So they are seen as citizens. So they have their own rights. Yeah. So what does that mean for currency? How does that mean for working with different capitals, for instance, nature capital? Yeah. So that really means that we need to expand the term of currency to a much wider. Yeah. I'm very critical about the term of creative economy, for instance, where it's pretty big in the UK, using design as a means for driving innovation and contributing to societal and economic gains. But what kind of economics can we come up with which are not money-based?
Yeah. Can I add something to that? Please. I think with the word currency in the way how everybody looks at it, it's so closely connected to ownership. Like, I have something, I might give it to you, I want something in return. It seems this returning system and this word ownership has been messing the society up in many ways. Like, this is mine, this is how I'm protective. I think we see it on both sides of the ocean, you know, this kind of protectiveness of looking at things, even at the river, like, oh, what does the river want if it's become something? So we have such a strong association with currency, or even giving something and the right to exist means, oh, it might have the right to own something. And I'm just interested in, can we cut that loose? Can we look at differently systems and not think in ownership, but in sharing or giving or generosity, without also going in the opposite direction of, oh, this is all just becoming a big hippie center. It should be the basic value of life. And you can have so many variations in that. And I think that's really wonderful to explore.
It's so interesting, because that takes us directly into a kind of a political and an economic conversation, and of course design is always implicated in that. But it's interesting to think about how you position your work relative to either being kind of inside, let's say, a capitalist system, or standing outside of it, particularly with questions of ownership.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like between us now, we're sitting here 2 by 2. What is our currency in this talk here? And like I said, we can't take us out of capitalism. Yes. On the other hand, we can, of course. I think designers are challenged to work outside of capitalistic systems. Yeah. And can we
create a different belief system? You know, can we enable people to think differently?
Exactly. I mean, there is this book, The Other 90%. So how can we actually design for these other 90% worldwide, which are not able to buy a luxurious chair or a nice design? Mm. So what is our stance there, and how can we use then a currency? So there are lots of big questions which we're not tackling today, I hope, but we can go talk a bit.
Yeah.
Jimmy, I think I cut you off a moment ago.
Oh, no. I had a silly question, maybe. Devil's advocate question, maybe. You mentioned earlier, Gunther, that a river recently became a citizen. When that happens, how do we listen to what the river needs and wants as a citizen? How are we... when we recognize it as an entity like that, how do we converse with? How do we converse?
That's a good question. I think that's a big part of my PhD also. I think at first it really means sitting next to it, just observing, being in the shoes of that river and feeling and what's going on, and what is the river transporting, what's inside, and really being with the river for a while, and ultimately you want to become a river.
Yeah. But I can tap a little bit into it. Maybe not the river part, but the nature part. Like earlier this month, I was on a residency, and it was also a short-lived week, and it was in Scotland, in the middle of nowhere. And it was also about, in the beginning, you come with an idea of what you want to execute. So that's where the question comes: what does nature want from me? What do I want from nature? And in that part there's a big emotional release in that. Also a release of understanding of a process of time in the days. And what I did there was every morning I went out with the camera and I practiced Shinrin Yoku, what is forest bathing. Every morning I went out, I filmed myself 3-4 hours in nature, and I was just conversing, talking, hanging around on trees. By the end of the week, I could actually walk by and have an emotional conversation with the tree on, hey, thanks for being here. And we had a really good time together. And it became this process of awareness that what resonance is about. And you need to be able to step out of your human shoes to find a kind of natural side of what does it mean to kind of exist. So it almost becomes kind of philosophical, but on the other side, it's really interesting that you kind of have to let go of the process of or understanding a language and really connect to nature as a way of, I'm here. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to inform myself. I think we're in this performance society. What are you doing? What do you get out of it? What are you working on? Sometimes it's okay to actually say, I'm just being, or I'm just having a conversation, even if it's not by language. And
exactly, and hopping onto this, it's really about looking at nature and learning from nature. For instance, about emergence or self-organization, that non-linearity, or open systems, unpredictability, ambiguity, multiple scales and levels. So how can we use those thinking to understand what nature needs, but ultimately also how can we use nature or lead with nature ourselves, and ultimately also our creative practices.
What's our nature?
And do you think that this is about learning or relearning? Because as you were talking, I kept thinking that this is something that humans used to be much more attuned to.
I agree to that part. I think it's relearning. I think it was a big part of our nature. We were part of it, and we kind of built a fence around it. We put it in a box. I think at the moment it's already in the basement, or we try to bury it, or we're already in the part we say, well, there's human nature. We create our own nature, and I think we're really on the side of, well, don't push it away and throw it away because it's part of our DNA. How can we open up our brain or ways of living to find different dimensions of being part of nature in a new way, and not just this rational, economical sense of how nature can be performing us or be to value of us. I think it's almost more, how can you be of value to nature? So nature and humans have been put opposite of each other, and I think it's time to kind of find a different dimension of engaging with each other.
And I know it's taking shape in forms of business. We all know about the loom of AI and singularity, which is upon us at a certain time. Skynet is not here yet, but also businesses are opening up to what it means to be human, but also the whole topic of new work movements, or becoming human at work, is now applied. Can we actually step a level higher, and can we look at nature? How can we use nature in a learning form, but also using analogies from nature to implement into business and creative practice settings? Yeah. And we all know about it in a way. We all know it's good to be out in nature. Why are not people more doing it?
Yeah, I think that what the research is showing, that it's actually good for our health.
Yeah, and you almost think, shouldn't we have known that already a long time ago? Because it's like, yeah.
Like, duh, right?
Yeah, duh. That's the best word.
That's the technical term.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what specifically are you going to be presenting at the inquiry, or what prompt are you going to offer those who have come to participate with you?
Yeah, I think the basis of what we want to do is create this kind of awareness of how you create a space, or how we can design space or awareness together about this kind of entering of new relationships. So when we applied for DesignInquiry to join, we focused on the theme of thin spaces, or it's called Andacht. It's a German word. Andacht, it means gathering of thoughts, of place, almost in meditative state. Thin spaces was a Celtic term of that you can go into nature in the world and create this kind of dimension where kind of reality and spirituality can meet. So they used, what you said earlier, there used to be lots of things very common for how we lived, how we perceived nature. And we created it now that we work together with the three of us, also Emily Lou's joining, on the idea of portal. Like, how can we create passages? How can we create spaces to continue through? How can we talk about what does it mean to be present, or what does it mean to actually connect? So we create, it's a bit of a mix. We're making a booklet, connecting up a lot of thinking and stories, writing down things we've been talking about, as also doing physical experimentation. So we've been developing just now currently these textiles that we're working really non-stop intuitive, also with tape on, and just making, you need sometimes material and physicality to create the conversation. And so Emily and I have been working a lot on textiles. It's called these noren. It's a Japanese curtain that normally hang in the restaurants. And they were also kind of passages to kind of connect through and continue through. So sometimes you need things from the way we live now to talk about a different way of living. And I think that will continue the next few days.
Yeah, we started very simple, practically, and taping a big circle on the concrete floor in the gallery here. Yeah. And we collected words around it, which means what does it mean to have a portal. But also in my interest, I'd like to invite people to just step into that. It's like, there's this, it's a silly, funny, strange thing on YouTube came up like 2 years ago, where people, owners of cats, cats they love boxes. So we have a cat, and she loves to jump into any kind of box and just sit in there. So there's this YouTube phenomenon where cat owners were using tape and tape a box on the floor. And cats were actually stepping into that box and sitting there. So, in that way, taking that silly experiment, saying I want to invite people to step into that circle and own it, and physically own it also, like kneel down or lie on your back, close your eyes for a few minutes, and imagine how can you connect to others in that room, but also to nature, to yourself, and to add in like, what does it mean at that moment, and what is your question coming from that?
Yeah. It's almost a setting of release, like just let go of how the construct is. Can you just release it for a moment? And I think that's where design inquiry really comes in. It's bring these people together. We can experiment this kind of release together. It's that way, I almost see it as a kind of safe space. And I think what we're doing has to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, really, seeing design inquiry for us is ultimately that portal. So it is both a portal which might beam things around, and we recently I read that the US Army came up that they're working on a technique called quantum entanglement, and they are basically in the stone age of beaming things. So it's really
who knows what happens on this Skype.
Design inquiry for us is that kind of portal where we can communicate with others on certain topics of what design mean for us and for our society. But it's also becoming a physical space ultimately.
Maybe we solve quantum entanglement this weekend. I don't know.
I was going to say, design inquiry seems to be like catnip for design kittens.
Oh, yeah.
Misfit design kittens.
Misfit design kittens.
Rolling over the floor at the end of the week.
Is some of your work what we're seeing in the background behind you right now?
Yeah, some of the experiments are here, and and we'll be still photographing them in context and experimenting with them. Also take them on the street. I mean, sometimes it's good to take things out of the gallery and go meet what's really out there. So we're still doing that. It's nice to have a kind of compressed, dense time, and you really come to deep talks, but also deep actions, and it's a roller coaster this week.
And I think, you sent us this question, what is our response to Futurespective? And I think just to hop onto that one, I mean, I think for both of us, it's that question. It's not something particular. I like that or I like these other things. They're all fantastic, but what's important for us seeing it as a whole. Yeah. A whole being which works together, which is life and is natural. And how can we use that to actually impact something? And we all know on certain forms of protest. Look at Hong Kong, look at Extinction Rebellion, or look at Greta Thunberg, how she is using rebellion and activism as a form to shift society. And especially in the part of Greta, where everything's future focused, how can we be in the now? So what can we actually do in this 5 days now to shift design in Portland and with everyone involved in that design inquiry?
Yeah. The future is so comfortable, the now can be so scary, yeah? But that's why we kind of need to try it. I think even for, like I tell my students always, like, go try it on the street. But go, do it yourself, you know, really be there, out there. Because it's about vulnerability. And I think that's a beautiful thing if we can kind of see it as a special space, so.
And also we can see with different eyes, like you spoke about at the beginning about political and capitalistic ideas. So we are from Netherlands or Germany, in my part, living in Netherlands for a long time. We are coming from a very different cultural setting. So we are seeing things here with different eyes. And how can we use that differences to alleviate and help people seeing it, their work also differently?
Yeah, I was talking with my students just a few hours ago about vulnerability in the design process. And you really do, I think, need these kinds of portals, as you're calling them. I think design inquiry is a kind of portal and also a safe space, right, in which to begin to unpack some of these questions that we have.
Yeah. I think they're becoming scarce in some way.
Yes.
Even with education systems, they're becoming scarce. You know, all the rules, all the systems, what you have to do in the practice even, you know, it's so easy to serve current economy in many ways, because people are like, I need to pay my rent, I have student loans, there's lots of pressure on it. How can you really harness this kind of space to actually flow free and come back to the DNA of what design is about? Like, we're kind of serving society, not with the current, but with a new perspective. But we kind of need to implement it, and we need space to kind of test it and maintain it and make people owners of it together. And it's not just a crazy artist coming in, doing something and then running out and life continues as normal. So I think that's where design inquiry comes in, and many other formats that are around the world that I really think connect, unite it in a way, make it something beautiful, regional, but keep connected on global scale, because it's so good to have this input from different places.
Second, we can also argue that we can think about the safe space, we can also think about the brave space.
Brave space.
Safe space is usually used in terms of feminism or other places where certain genders are not allowed because they are feeling themselves safe. But we can also talk about like a brave space. So how can we be more brave in that setting? And ultimately, what I love also from a architectural urban point of view, how would those spaces actually look like physically? So can we design physical spaces in cities or at points of high traffic, airports or retail centers, which work as a space to connect to each other, to that spirituality of the moment, to ourselves?
Not to set you apart.
No, but also like how Richard Sennett called it, like porous places, like unscripted actions. And there are not much of these spaces. Have there been maybe in the past, maybe churches, I don't know. And so I think there's a longing for those new forms of spaces.
New definition of community.
Yeah, I think that's such a critical issue. I mean, it's certainly something that we think a lot about it in design inquiry, but one wonders too the idea of making those spaces in a kind of deliberate way. You mentioned the church. I mean, I think it was Krakauer who talked about the hotel lobby at the beginning of the 20th century as
marketplace at some point. You know?
Co-working centers, yeah.
Well, and I do think that's really interesting. I also appreciate the way that you, as much as we think about the value of safe space, we also know that it's become an incredibly politicized term, one that increasingly can be perceived as something that is ironically almost the opposite of safe because of the way that it seems to shut down discussion. So I like that notion of a brave space, one that allows for
you go like, let's do this.
Yeah, an assertion of self.
Yeah, it's like almost like a gym where you train yourself.
We didn't talk about this.
And train your mind, your body to become fit for the things which gets thrown at you outside.
That is definitely a brave space for me.
So one of the things that I have always appreciated about the opportunity that Design Inquiry presents is to meet folks who are in design, but who are in perhaps different disciplinary spaces or silos, however you want to call it. So, and within that, I've discovered that everybody's always reading something different, that just your references are perhaps different. So what are you both reading these days that you feel are having an impact on the work that you're doing?
Yeah. One that I'm actually currently reading, or I'm trying to get through it. It's a book from Valise. It's on artist residencies, reclaiming time and space. And they write in a quite broad way about the urgency for having these kind of spaces, but they also really go back in historical view, like how these residencies came to be, but also why is it important to keep them and what kind of shape, what are the conditions of residencies. And it's kind of a nice liberating way of looking at what it means to reside. Why do we need to be on other places sometimes? And so I've been really enjoying that.
I just nibble to my notes here. So I'm reading a lot, but currently I'm reading a book from Arne Næss. It's a Norwegian author, and the book on the ecology of wisdom, and where he researchers work on deep and shallow ecological thinking, advocating that a true understanding of nature gives rise to a point of view that appreciated the value of social adversity and the complex interrelations which we work as humans and nature. So it's really thinking, what can we think about in terms of ecological thinking and come to new understanding. So that is definitely a big part of my reading. And well, we also read like lots of other things like kind of newspapers online and so what stuff and it's all
stuff.
And I was actually I found it quite interesting that you sent this question. So what are we reading and what are we watching and listening? That's probably the next question which you're answering. So we can almost step to the next question. So the topic of watching is interesting because I think there is of course, Netflix is everywhere. You have Hulu. We have all these channels.
I don't have Netflix.
We don't have a TV at home, so we just turn on the TV.
That no longer gives you any kind of street cred because you can stream everything. So, but anyway, go.
We can stream everything and we download series, but we are getting bombarded with lots of things, and so we are.
I'd rather look outside.
Yeah, we just go out and watch other people.
You're watching the nature and the people.
Yeah, and our cat's sitting in the box, and so of course you watch things, but it's rather not interesting.
Yeah. I think there's almost a TV fatigue at some point. You know, you just get so overloaded, and it's almost more that you think, can I just look at this beautiful screen around me? That's reality.
We have this allotment, which we have like 4 years almost, in
very organic,
close to our place, very cheap price, about 180 square meter. And once we are stressed, we're coming home from work, and I mean, we could talk about design ongoing, but that doesn't make sense.
We can talk about vegetables much longer.
So we just go there, we put our clothes on, we dig in the dirt, and after 10-15 minutes, we are so in tune with nature, just doing something in silence, and that is watching. That is what it should be about.
It's nourishing.
Yes.
I can't nourish the TV. I can nourish some veggies I'm growing, so I like that better.
That's a beautiful thought to end our conversation on. You cannot nourish a TV. Yes. Judith Vandenboom and Gunther Wehmeyer, thank you for joining us today on Universal Lunch. It's been such a pleasure to meet and converse with you.
And have a wonderful several days in Portland at the Design Inquiry Currency Pop-Up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Good talking with you, and hope we see you soon, face to face.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, literally.
Yeah.
We'll see you out in the nature.
On the other side of the screen.
Exactly.
Okay. Will do.
Have a good day.
Thanks for having us.
See you soon.
Thank you.
And Jimmy, I think I'm going to be solo next week. Is that correct?
You will be.
All right. Well, then
I'm so sad about that, but I will be on a plane at this time. I'll be going to the Vancouver Art Book Fair, and we'll be releasing some new publications there that I'm kind of excited about. So I will be so sad to miss your guests next week, though.
Well, you'll be able to catch up with them once it's up on our YouTube channel. And I'm delighted to just give you all a wee preview. Next week, we're going to be talking to Peter A. Hall, who is a design critic and design theorist currently based in London. I would be remiss if I did not also mention that he was one of the co-founders of Design Inquiry. And I'm very much looking forward to having an extended conversation with Peter next week about design discourse and design education and any other things we want to talk about. And then we're going to be joined by Laura Rempel and Anita Cooney. Laura is an art historian and a fashion designer and bespoke tailor based in Toronto. And Anita Cooney, a longtime design inquirer, who is an architect and currently the Dean of Design at Pratt Institute. And Anita is someone who has a profound interest in fashion. And so Laura and Anita are going to be having, hopefully with a little prompting by me, having what I hope will be a really interesting conversation about structure, design, materiality, and intersections of art, architecture, and fashion. So we hope that you'll all be able to join us for our live stream next week. And if not, you can catch us up on our YouTube channel.
That sounds so intimidating to talk to some fashion savvy next week. Have you planned your outfit? Is my question.
I have not, but I will think about that ahead of time. I had a chat with Laura earlier in the week where because she wanted to just kick around what I was going to kick around, and I will definitely not be wearing rayon because she made it very clear that she cannot stand rayon unless it is vintage Italian or French rayon, and I'm pretty sure I have none of that in my closet. So I may, I think I have one or two Prada vests that I bought on eBay because I can only, of course, afford to buy Prada from eBay. But I may dig some of that up to put that on. But no, I haven't thought about that. If only I had purchased some of Laura's clothing, then I would be able to wear it.
I know.
But too
Maybe
late.
You can get her to send you some, just for the show.
Yeah, just in time. Yeah,
just to model for the show. I'm gonna miss you so much next week.
I know. This has become something one looks forward to. But that's all right. We'll have extra a lot to catch up on. But then it'll be 2 weeks for our guests. So Jimmy is going to be away next week when he's in Vancouver. And then the following week, he'll be solo because I'm going to be in Cincinnati speaking at the Cincinnati Preservation's annual forum. So we're both going to be off on our other professional engagements for the next 2 weeks. So gosh, when we come back 3 weeks hence, there will really be a lot for us to talk about.
Yes, so much to catch up on. Well, dear viewers out in internet land, this has been Universal Lunch, out of office, uncommon hours on the occasion of Futurespective. We will see you soon.
Yes, indeed. We will see you anon. And by the end of the day, you'll be able to see the recording of this on Design Inquiry's YouTube channel. So I'm Gabrielle Esperdy in New York.
And I'm Jimmy Liu in Austin, Texas.
And we'll see you soon. Thank you.